welcome viewers to this very special edition of India Foundation's Vodcast series. We have a very special guest with us, Mr. Simon Anholt. He's a dear friend and an incredibly well-established independent policy advisor who for the past 20 years has worked with the heads of state and heads of government of 56 plus nations to help them to improve their economic, political, and cultural engagements with the international community. He's also responsible for enabling these countries and heads of state by raising their profiles to enhance their trade, tourism, diplomatic and cultural relations. The reason I sort of got introduced to Simon a couple of years back was his fascinating Good Country Index. It is a study measuring the impact of each of 163 countries on the rest of humanity and the planet. His TED Talk, launching the first edition of the Good Country Index, has passed 10 million views and has been ranked by the viewers of TED as the fourth most inspiring ever published. So we are so glad to have Simon with us, one of the most influential and respected advisors of the international community. Thank you so much, Simon, for joining me. Recently read your fascinating book, The Good Country Equation, which is set to be out in August later this year. I want to begin with assessing or perhaps helping our viewers understand your journey. You know, you write where for the last 20 years you've worked as an independent policy advisor to presidents, prime ministers, monarchs, and governments of more than 50 plus countries. And you've also illustrated how you've helped engage more productively and imaginatively with governments, right? Tell us what has inspired you to doing what you do?
Well, what inspired me to do the work and what inspired me to write the book are really two different subjects. What inspired me to undertake the career I've undertaken, honestly, it's more of an accident than a design. I would be lying if I said I planned in advance what I was going to spend my adult life doing. I sort of fell into it. What happened was that back in around about 1999, here in the UK, the then Prime Minister, Tony Blair, started becoming very interested in the idea of the image of Britain.
Yeah.
And because I knew something about this topic, and I'd written a couple of academic papers on country image and country reputation, I was invited to participate in those conversations. And that gradually developed into something which we called the Public Diplomacy Board, which was the Foreign Office's first serious foray into soft power in a consistent and a structured way. So I've been involved with the UK's initiative since the early days. And gradually what I found was that as I wrote more and more on this subject, more and more governments would get in touch and ask for my advice. At the beginning, it was really always about country image, or as I mistakenly called it, nation brand. So that's how my career happened. It was just basically one or two governments asking for my advice, me honestly learning as much as I was teaching along the way, and then gradually forming a set of views and opinions and a body of experience, which gradually made me more and more useful to other governments. And it took off from there. And that's what I've spent the last 20 or so years doing. Writing the book, well, it was just because I got sick of my family and friends telling me after every trip, when are you going to write down about all of these amazing experiences? Yeah. And so the period of the pandemic seemed like a perfect time. Actually, I began to write sometime before that, but this felt like a good moment to sit down, chew my pen for a bit and say, So I've done a lot of things and been to a lot of places and had some quite interesting experiences with some quite prominent politicians. And maybe I can be helpful by sharing those experiences with other people who haven't met these people and haven't had these conversations.
Absolutely. I just want to dwell upon this fact that, I've noticed that you have inherent interest in the way people perceive the products and the countries they come from and the way they are linked. And you brought this out very significantly in the book as well. Are they both linked? Uh, what have been some of your inferences, if you could explain?
Well, I guess that was my journey, because before I started working with countries at the beginning of the 21st century, previously I'd been involved in the private sector. Yeah. And I was very interested in the whole idea of brand image and reputation. And it began to occur to me that this construct, that a reputation is the most valuable thing that a corporation can have. If it has a good image, then almost everything else is easier and cheaper. It began to occur to me that this could apply just as well to places, to countries and cities and regions. And I began to realize that the countries which have a good brand image, and I put that in heavy inverted commas because it's a metaphor, let's put it that way. It's always a mistake to try to make very, very close analogies between companies and countries, because after all, they exist for very different reasons. Nonetheless, there are some parallels to be made. And I found that this idea of brand image and brand equity, the idea that if you have a good and powerful reputation as a country, as a nation, everything is easier and everything is cheaper. And if you're a country with a weak or a negative reputation, everything is difficult and everything is expensive. And so it began to occur to me that this topic of country image had been basically ignored forever. And yet it is responsible for directing the flows of uncountable trillions of dollars every year. And so I made this statement back in the late 1990s that responsible governments in the 21st century must understand that in addition to being policymakers, they are also custodians of the good name of their country. And that's the most precious thing that a country has.
So this single factor prompted you to come up with the term nation branding. And I briefly recall that you wrote an academic paper first on this topic, nation branding.
Yes, and I feel that I ought to stress that I never, in the first place, I never used the term nation branding. Okay. It sounds rather petty, but actually the term I used was nation brand. And you might well say, well, what difference can 3 letters make? But actually, it's quite a significant difference, because nation brand is simply an observation about the importance of reputation. Nation branding sounds like a promise. It sounds like you're saying, if you don't like your image, then you can manipulate it artificially using the tricks and techniques of marketing communications. This is propaganda. Let's call it by its proper name. And the interesting thing is that in the context of countries, it doesn't work. And I've spent most of the last 20 years researching the images of countries, trying to see if there is some correlation between the amount of self-promotion that countries do and the quality and the size and the scale of their image, and there is no correlation. Now, you do a campaign like Incredible India, a beautiful piece of work, and a lot of money spent on the media to make sure that everybody in the world sees it. It was a very, very serious effort. But that was primarily a tourism campaign. Yeah. And tourism is a relatively straightforward marketing exercise. You tell people about your beautiful country, you show them images, and maybe they'll buy. That's very simple. But that's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about trying to change, to influence the overall image of the country. And that's a different matter altogether. People judge countries by the way they behave, not by the things they say about themselves. So the conclusion is, as I've always said, if you want to be admired, you must be admirable. You must do things that make a difference to other people in other countries. You must contribute somehow to humanity and the planet, to the international community. You must give people a reason to feel glad that you exist. Simply bragging about your assets and successes and achievements will not change your image.
I really like that line, and something that I picked up from your talks as well as your writings, your message for the countries, right? Don't tell them to admire you, be admirable. Do you have any example, a short case study where you've advised a particular country and you find that country admirable?
Yes, I mean, I have to say that although I've worked for a lot of countries, my portfolio is not stuffed full of brilliant, successful case studies of countries that have somehow
You're
done
being too
everything
humble.
I was. Well, the reality, I'm afraid, is that most democratically elected governments are simply not in power for long enough to make these kinds of changes. Because
Right.
in order for a country to earn itself a better image, it does take generations, it takes decades. And very few governments are in power for that long. And of course, when a new government comes in, they will systematically tear up everything that the previous government has done and start again. So
Yeah.
it's very, very difficult for governments to take my advice. But having said that, I think that South Korea has done a very good job.
Right.
And one of the things that South Korea did, yes, it did spend a lot of money on self-promotion. I don't think that made much difference except perhaps to tourism. But more importantly, what South Korea did was it started engaging through cultural relations. The Korean wave, the Hallyu, the Korean videos, the Korean music, Gangnam style, Korean
Absolutely.
cuisine, reaching out and doing cultural relations with people all over the world so that people got to know and to like and to trust Korean culture, which is a very important step towards people getting to know and like and trust Korean people. So that was the first thing they did, absolutely textbook fashion. They did a very, very good job. But the other, perhaps more important thing, was they began to behave more like an engaged principal partner in the international community. They started giving more development assistance to poorer countries. They started getting more deeply involved in the negotiations between North Korea, United States, China, and generally making themselves useful in the international community. And I do believe that more than anything else, more than Gangnam style, more than cuisine, it was that stepping up to the mark and behaving like a responsible international citizen that really caused South Korea's image to improve. And it has improved. You can see it in my indexes.
One thread that I pick up from reading your works as well as your recent book is the emphasis that you lay on countries to work collaboratively together. Do you think that is possible in this era?
I think it's possible. I think it's essential. And I think it's happening. At the moment, we're all very depressed, many of us. We're depressed partly because of the pandemic, which is a very depressing event. I think we're also very depressed because the media, as we know, does tend to report the more shocking, the more frightening, the more upsetting news. There is a bit of a tendency at the moment for countries and leaders of countries to experiment with nationalism, um, with inward-looking policies, to turn their backs on the multilateral system. Um, and this is something that happens in history from time to time. The pendulum does tend to swing backwards and forwards from outward-looking multilateralism to inward-looking multinationalism. And at the moment, the pendulum is swinging to that side. But despite that, I personally feel very optimistic. I feel that things are going in the right direction. As is typical for Homo sapiens, we're discovering the right thing to do at the last possible moment, at the 11th hour and the 59th minute, but we are beginning to learn. The main reason why I feel optimistic is because of the younger generations who've been brought up with digital technology, with the internet. And to them, it seems absolutely normal to think as much about the global challenges, climate change, migration, terrorism, pandemics, as it does to think about domestic challenges. They don't see this distinction between domestic and international. That we older people do. Forgive me for including you in my advanced age group, but you know what I mean. And for this reason, the human race is gradually becoming, on balance, more internationally minded, more young people. If you do research on this and you ask people, do you feel that you are a member of the human race first or a citizen of your own nation first, more young people will say the human race first. Older people will tend to say my own nation first. So this naturally cosmopolitan attitude, this sense of belonging to humanity, of being a citizen of the world, is becoming more and more common with every generation. So I think in a few years' time, we're not going to find that extreme inward-looking nationalism is a big deal anymore. I think it's already on the way out, just as it's starting to come in again.
That. I like this line also where you mention how you've come to like simplicity. So you say not the simplicity that comes from seeing only the surface of things, but the simplicity that comes from seeing through the surface. Could you help our viewers understand more about the essence of this line?
I suppose this is a very simple theory of wisdom, that when you're young, you try very hard to be intelligent, and you may have a good brain and you may be very intelligent, but you don't have a lot of experience. So you have the mechanisms, but you don't have the data. You know, when you're designing artificial intelligence applications, what you need is big data. You need millions and millions and millions of case studies in order to check the rightness or the wrongness of your decision making. And it's the same with people. So when you're young, you try to be intelligent, you try to be smart, you try to have opinions. You're actually much too young to have opinions. I find the older I get, the fewer opinions I have, because you start getting better and better and better at seeing every side of every issue. When you've been through life's journey and you've had many experiences and you've met many people and you've read many books, there's a tendency for you to become more and more complex. And what I've tried very hard to do is to go the other way, to go back to the simplicity of a child, but with the weight of experience behind it. And it seems to me that that is wisdom. And that's the best thing that we can all aspire to. Not to become more and more difficult to understand as we understand more and more things, but to become easier and easier and easier to understand as we understand more things. So that's why I say, not the simplicity that comes from seeing the surface of things, but the simplicity that comes from seeing through the surface of things to the essential simplicity beneath.
We dwell a little bit on the technicalities of the work that you do. Knowledge and data are key pillars to providing effective solutions for governments worldwide, and you have alluded to this as well. How challenging is it to combine both knowledge and data to provide effective solutions to governments worldwide, in your experience?
Well, Sudarshan, to me, it's a joy combining those two things. I don't. Yes, of course, it's difficult. In one sense, it would be easier just to give unsupported opinions on things, but that would make me feel bad because I don't want to tell governments things that are just my opinion. And so I very much enjoy working in this way, that I spend probably about half of my time working with data, collecting data, doing polling, doing composite indexes like the Good Country Index, so that I have lots and lots of numbers there. And then the other half of my time trying to convert that into simple, practical recommendations for governments, for whoever wants that advice. To me, this is the only really legitimate form of selling advice. To sell advice just because you think you're clever or wise, I don't think is very legitimate, because nobody is that clever or wise. If you're going to be selling advice, and especially if, like me, you advise governments, it's taxpayers' money that's paying my bill. Yeah. So that involves a very, very serious responsibility. And therefore, it's absolutely essential that any advice I give to a government can be supported by proper research.
I'll come to the other periphery. How are creativity and imaginative thinking important to policy making, and even when it comes to providing effective solutions? Can you illustrate with an example?
This is a fantastic question, and it's really one of my favorite aspects of the whole thing. Creativity is the magic ingredient, which makes the impossible possible. Many years ago, I worked in the advertising industry briefly as a copywriter. As a matter of fact, I worked in India as a copywriter. I worked at Clarion Advertising in New Delhi and also in Mumbai, which was a fascinating experience. But that was back in the 1980s, when India was a very different place. What I learned during my brief period in advertising was of the power and the magic of creative thinking. Now, creative is a difficult word.
Yeah.
My simple definition of the word creative is that it is simply the opposite of boring, right? And the trouble I've found with a great many the politicians and civil servants I work with is that they're not boring people, almost never. They're on the whole marvelous people with a very good principles, but they have this idea that when you're in government, because you're responsible for the lives and livelihoods of millions of people, it's all very serious, and it is very serious. And they make the mistake of thinking that in order to be serious, you have to be boring. And the policies you come up with and the ideas you come up with must resemble other ideas and other policies that have been approved in the past. So politicians have a tendency to take the very, very, very safest options and the very safe routes. It doesn't matter what their politics are. Even on the extreme right and the extreme left, you see the same thing, doing things that won't shock or surprise or alarm people. And I think this is very dangerous. I think that if you want policies that really work, that really make change, and that really resonate with large numbers of people, which they must do if they're going to work, then you must be creative. You must be the opposite of boring. And it's that little magic ingredient, what Edward de Bono called lateral thinking, coming at the problem from an unexpected angle, that means that genius is there. You can always find a genius idea, and it works a million times better than a boring idea. So this to me is fundamental.
We'll touch upon the future of power. You consciously do not allude to the terms of hard power, soft power, smart power. Do you not believe in the concept of power? What, according to you, is the future of power?
Well, I do mention once or twice in the book the phrase soft power, and acknowledge that this is the extraordinary insight of Joseph Nye, a man who I admire very much. But I begin to have a problem with the whole concept of soft power. And the problem I have with it is that it's still power. And therefore, it's still about finding ways of achieving ascendancy over other nations. It still comes from a mindset that says, how can we defeat the other country? How can we steal a march on the other country? How can we earn more money than the other country? It's still fundamentally competitive. And whether you achieve your ascendancy over other countries by fighting with the traditional weapons of hard power, or whether you do it by hitting them over the head with a pillow, which is which is soft power, culture, or whatever it is, you're still trying to beat them. And this, for me, is the problem. I don't think that life on Earth is a sprint to the finish, where one country comes first and all the others come last. You see, I don't have a problem when Donald Trump says America first. This seems to me to be a statement of the obvious. Of course, if you're elected to run a country, you must put the interests of that country first. But what I find rather depressing and rather old-fashioned about Donald Trump's view is the idea that therefore all the other countries must come last. And that's not the case. They can't and they won't. And if they do, America will also fail. Life on Earth is a team sport. It's not a sprint to the finish. And unless we can change the culture of governance worldwide from fundamentally competitive to fundamentally collaborative, then the grand challenges of climate change, migration, terrorism, and pandemics, and all the rest of it will finish us off. So I'm jumping ahead here, but the reason why I wrote this book is to clarify this single critical point. The thing that's wrong with the world is not climate change, pandemics, migration, terrorism, nuclear proliferation, and all of those individual challenges. The thing that's wrong with the world is that we countries don't collaborate sufficiently to tackle those problems. We know the answers to all of those problems, but the reason why we don't implement them, the reason we don't fix climate change or any of those other issues, is because it would require consistent collaboration between countries, and we just don't do that enough. So the change that is required to save the world, to save humanity, is a change in the fundamental culture of governance from competitive to collaborative. And this is what we need to try to achieve.
So, going by this theory of yours, so what role do you foresee for a UN, for a Commonwealth, etc., to play in this era then?
They're going to have to change. I don't think there's any doubt about that. We all know that the UN in particular was designed in an age very different from our own and to cope with challenges very different from the challenges we're facing today. I think the UN still does a wonderful job. I think UNDP and the other aid and development bodies are extraordinary. And I think we'd be very badly off without them. The General Assembly and the Security Council, leave those to one side. They are anachronistic and dysfunctional. And whilst they do help to maintain the peace, one could design something an awful lot better if one started from scratch today. I don't think there's any doubt about that. The Commonwealth, well, I was lucky enough to give the opening address to the heads of government meeting at the Commonwealth in Malta a few years ago. And my single message to the Commonwealth was, if you want to survive and you want to prosper as an organization, you need to turn yourself inside out. And instead of being the world's largest self-help group, where you all look inwards and just figure out how to make things better for the members of the Commonwealth, turn yourselves inside out, and you could become the biggest, most powerful agency for change that the world has ever seen, because the Commonwealth is extraordinary. The number of countries, the cumulative experience, the 30% of the world's population, Lord knows how much of its economy. This could be the biggest agent for change ever, if only it stopped microscoping and it started telescoping. So that's my message. I don't think in time any of these institutions will survive unless they learn to look outwards and unless they learn not to look inwards in that way. I think that it's easy enough to play the game of redesigning the multilateral institutions. Both of us have spent many happy hours doing so. And in a way, it's great fun. But the problem with that kind of thought exercise is that nobody has the authority to impose a new system on the world. And so we are kind of wasting our time when we design new global parliaments and all of these other projects that students of international relations are constantly being set. My experience is that it's actually easier to change the culture than it is to change the system. And when the culture changes, the system must change. So my approach is to start with the culture, the way that governments perceive international relations, the way that politicians are trained and brought up, the way that the human race is educated and brought up, and then the systems will have to change as a consequence of that.
My final question is, what is a good country? I'm sure you partly alluded to that in the conversation. What is a good country index, and what is your good country equation?
A good country, in the way that I use the term, is a country that successfully harmonizes its domestic and its international responsibilities. In other words, it manages to do the right thing for its own people and its own slice of territory, whilst at the same time doing no harm to any other people or any other part of the planet, and preferably doing good. So what I've found is that the majority of politicians, whatever their political background, believe automatically that anything you do that's good for your own people is going to be bad for somebody else somewhere. There'll be a negative consequence somewhere further down the line. Anything that you do that's good for the planet is going to harm your own economy or your own people's prospects or whatever. And they don't question this. And it's a very, very dangerous assumption because it is entirely wrong. And over the 20 years or so that I've been advising governments, I've had the privilege to be able to try out new forms of policy making and actually see them operating in real countries. And what I've found is that we've barely begun to scratch the surface of good governance in the 21st century. Once you start trying to harmonize the domestic and the international, and you also engage with other countries as you do it, you learn from their experiences, you collaborate, you cooperate, you mix things up in the craziest way you can imagine. India should be making policy not just with Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and the Maldives. It should be making policy with Uruguay, Kenya, and Greenland. The more you stir up the culture pool, the more you stir up national experiences, the more original, the more creative, the more dynamic, and the more global your solutions become. As I say, very few governments have even begun to try basic collaboration along this way. So a good country is a country that does that. and it will not be punished. I'm not talking about altruism here. I'm not saying that countries need to sacrifice themselves for the good of other countries. That's a stupid, condescending Victorian idea. It's charity. The responsibility of the rich to help the poor. Sure, fine, whatever, but that's not going to solve the world's problems. The world's problems are only going to be solved when all countries perceive themselves as equal members of this team, which is the world that we live in, and contribute equally, irrespective of what's happened in the past. And so a good country is a country that understands all of those things. The Good Country Index simply attempts to measure that. So it combines 35 data sets, mostly from the United Nations, which measure the external impacts of 160 or so countries. And you can compare that with the Human Development Index or some other respectable measurement of domestic and see the two sides of the equation. What does this country do for its own people in its own territory with the Human Development Index, and what does this country do for the rest of the world and for the rest of the planet using the Good Country Index? So that way we begin to get a much more holistic, a much more global picture of each country's contribution to itself and to the whole of humanity. And finally, which countries are good? Well, none. To be honest with you, if the Good Country Index, I've often considered...
You have some surprising choices that have made it to number 5.
Yes, you say choices, but I don't choose. It's just the data. There's no opinion in this. It's simply a simple arithmetic. Yes, I mean, I was very pleased, for example, when Kenya came into the top 30 in the first edition, because that proved something I was very anxious to prove, that we're not measuring how much money countries have to spend on helping poor countries. That's a very, very small part of the overall whole. So relatively poor countries can perform quite well in the Good Country Index. On the whole, they don't, but there are exceptions to prove that it's possible. If I had my way, the top 39 places in the Good Country Index would be blank. And the number one country, the one that demonstrably contributes the most to the world, whether it's Finland or Sweden or whichever predictable Scandinavian country it is every year, they would be 41. Because even the countries that come at the top of the Good Country Index, they're not truly good countries. They cooperate and they collaborate more than most, but still nothing like enough if we're going to make the world work.
Thank you so much, Simon. I know you've also in the book you've illustrated how you have some more thoughts for the future and for the viewers. The reason I'm saying this is that in August this year, Simon's book, The Good Country Equation, is going to be out. His famous speech is still available on TED. You'll understand from where he comes and why he does what he does best. So thank you so much, Simon, for joining us. We wish that we have you in India soon, once the situation normalizes. Thank you so much for joining me, and please take care and stay safe.
Thank you, Sudarshan, and the same to you.